Hello, and welcome to the Digital Workspace Works podcast. I'm Ryan Purvis, your host, supported by our producer Heather Bicknell. In this series, you'll hear stories and opinions from experts in the field, stories from the front lines, the problems they face and how they solved them, the areas they focused on from technology, people and processes, to the approaches they took that will help you to get to the grips with the digital workspace inner workings.
So I did a presentation yesterday, and I'm not sure if I can actually say the event, so I'm just going to say I did one yesterday, on burnout. And it was quite interesting what came out of that. It was all to a bunch of CIOs, CTOs, head of IT, etc. And we covered, my sort of presentation was to level set it. So, what is burnout? And then there's three categories or three types of burnout. There's frenetic, which is the one that we mostly feel, which is the multitude of things you got to do, and that being always pressing. Then there's, let me actually get it up because I've now forgotten. My brain is fried today. I always find when I do a presentation that the next day I'm exhausted. There's bore out, which is when you're underworked and under challenged, which I've never had in my life. I suppose I'm not in a real career. But and then there's worn out, which is the second one, which is when you're ground down by heavy demands that persist over time. And I was saying in my speech, I mean, this week has been just like that, frenetic and worn out. Too many things to do, too much stuff happening at home. My wife, we think, has had COVID, so she's been down for a couple of days. My daughter's had some issues. So, it's fine when work is busy because you can just be busy with work. But when your other stuff kicks in, then that's the frenetic and then the worn out piece. The other thing that I found interesting in the research that I did is that the burnout ratio or the percentage of people affected rose through the pandemic, which is not unexpected, but it rose by 10%, which is quite a big amount if you consider that as an increasing value. And 2/3 of the respondents to the survey that I looked at, they felt that the pandemic actually made burnout worse, whereas 30% felt it got better. But the interesting thing about all of that was that 86% said that mundane tasks were the biggest issue for them, and that took about 1/3 of their work week and got in the way of doing their jobs. And I'm thinking about things like filling in timesheets and doing a weekly report or something like that really no one reads. Those sorts of things that are all back to the old days, and I'm talking the old days when they were in the factories where they try to put these management procedures in place, and how those affect people's time. And these are the sorts of things that, what people want is to have a purpose and do things they want that brings out a passion in them. And doing mundane, boring things that have no value, counteracts that completely.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Those three types of burnout, I hadn't heard it broken down that way before. So it was, you said frenetic, bore out, and worn out?
And worn out, yeah.
I think of bore out like the kid in the class who's too far ahead and their teacher isn't giving them more advanced work to do, so they act out. That's what that makes me think of.
That or you're a really driven person and you're told to go and become a coffee maker. Not a barista. But I'm talking about someone like a tea person. You sit there and you make instant coffee with 2 sugars and milk. Which is an insulting role for someone with aptitude and skills. Not that there's anything wrong with a tea maker, but if you are overqualified or not geared for that kind of work, and you should be doing something a bit more to your skill set, then that could bore you out completely.
Sure. Yeah. I think that depends on what you've decided your life priorities are, and then whether or not, that you want to use more of your brain at work, or your physical skill set, or if you want work to just be a very kind of something, that gives you a paycheck. And then I'm just thinking of a lot of like artists, for example, who might be baristas, but and for some people that is their art. But anyway, back to
on the barista point, if you're a barista, I would see that as, and I say a proper one. It's like being a sommelier or something like that. If it's your passion and you're good at it, that I could see being a very fulfilling job. That, yes, it might be stressful in the sense that you work long hours in order to earn reasonable money, because most of those would be hourly waged jobs. But I've got no problem with those for a period of time. But I'm saying if you're a 50-year-old person who hasn't done anything else but be that role, I would personally be concerned with myself if I was in that position.
Yeah, when I was just thinking that, regardless of role, if you're in the same role for too long without getting any new challenge, without any change, without a promotion, without getting new challenges, without something changing, it's kind of inevitable that you would hit the bore out type of burnout.
Yeah.
So what else? What was so it was a kind of discussion format after you presented? Is that kind of what it was?
Yeah. So it was a town hall. I did a 10-minute level set, which is what I was kind of talking to you on the presentation now. And then we had a breakout with 3 questions, which I can't remember what those were. But in essence, we talked about each question for 10 minutes. And then there was a summary piece and then just a general chat. And it was very interesting. It covers a lot of things that we've covered in our conversations around being a digital nomad, working from home, hybrid working, those sorts of things. And one of the questions that I posed during my presentation is, did working hybrid help or hinder burnout? And when you take into account people that have been forced due to the pandemic to work from home, there were obviously additional things added to their lifestyle or their work style that they didn't have before. Additional caring responsibilities, homeschooling, caring for parents or relatives. During the pandemic, there were obviously people that were furloughed in the UK or in other countries lost their jobs. So someone else had to help them survive if the government couldn't help them. Greater stress and anxiety from the unknown. Not having the tools, the digital tools to do their jobs. You imagine you got told to stay at home on the Friday and you start work on Monday, but you don't have a laptop or a desktop at home to do your job, but your job requires those things. And then the other thing was around newly remote workers to look busy. And I think that came up in lots of conversations, even before yesterday's session. People that are unproven having to now prove themselves, or a new joiner, first job, doesn't know what the work culture or life is, and doesn't even know where to start from day one. So how do you factor those people in and give them that sense of what they need to do?
And you said these were CIOs mostly on the call. Do CIOs, and maybe you can speak to this from your experience too, is burnout, how much of burnout is the responsibility of the CIO versus, the HR department versus the CEO? Kind of where do you see the CIO's ownership of the burnout conversation?
Well, yeah, so we should ask that question, because that's a really good question. So it came up in many ways. One, and I'll talk to other conversations having this as well. One is that the CIO or the CTO, whoever owns technology leader, has 2 roles. One role is obviously being a leader for their own team and teams, and the other role is working with business colleagues. And in the first instance, it's like any leadership. You need to look after people. You need to make sure they've been taken care of. and you need to be aware of people on the downward trend to help bring them up one way or another. When it comes to the other role of connecting with the other business partners, or in partnership, HR is very good at, and I'm speaking this very generally, are very good at policies and procedures and that sort of thing, protecting the organization from HR issues. But they're not very good at the implementation of technologies for those things, for example. So running a pulse survey might be something that they would ask technology to do for them if they didn't have the tool already, or to bring in a tool for them. So what I understood back to sort of March 2020 is there was a much closer relationship between technology and HR. In some respects, a lot of those policies and procedures were challenged because they actually couldn't be implemented as a check and balance policy. And I can't give you an example because I don't have one, but I would think something like, if you look at remote working, there's a push in some companies to have you in the office 3 days a week. But to have you in the office 3 days a week might mean that you are coming all the way into the office to sit on the phone all day long. And you're now using a different desk each day because you're hot desking. And each time you come in, you're wasting precious time setting up your machine and getting organized to just do calls all day because there's actually no collaboration in the office. But that would be an HR policy that's been implemented, but the technology hasn't backed it up. Now, if you'd stayed at home, you would have saved the time of setup. You would also probably have a better setup at home if you've got the means. And I was explaining to someone yesterday, my office at home is much superior to what I ever have in an office environment because I've paid for it myself and I bought the things I wanted. If a company wanted to provide that for me, they have to provide it for everyone. And that becomes cost prohibitive. So, when you look at it like that, there's an HR policy to get you in, but now it's up to technology to make sure you stay. And if that's the expectation of what you should get has gone up now. Before you were allowed to work from home, you kind of just accepted what you were given as a corporate standard. But now you can have your own standard at home. So you're like, well, if I've got these things at home, I've got 2 screens, I've got my standing desk, etc. If I've got all that, I must have that at the office for me to go to the office. If I don't have that, then I'm not even going to take my laptop to work with me. I'm going to go there to meet people. I'm not going to go on phone calls all day because then I'm doing face-to-face time. And I say that tongue-in-cheek because I would never leave my laptop at home. But I probably see myself going into the office and not worrying about being productive technically in that day. I would see it as me going to the office to collaborate with people, and I'd use the train trip in and out to do emails and write things up or whatever. So that's how it came out in conversation.
Yeah, that's all. It's all interesting. It also makes me think the thing that I've heard people complain about in the office versus home is actually Wi-Fi. Funnily enough, their home Wi-Fi being better than the office Wi-Fi, which really matters when you are not doing like the in-person collaboration piece as much and you are spending all day on calls. That's when you really feel the connectivity piece. But
well, I remember working for an organization where we had 40 people for 8 desks. And there was all these collaboration spaces. So what would happen is we'd all get in because we all have, people to see and things to do, and all of us would be there. But there wasn't enough space. So those 8 desks would be allocated to the so-called office workers, people that need a dedicated desk. And then we would go and use all the collaboration spaces. But then that would irritate the other people because they'd be like, well, I can't go to the coffee shop and sit because this team has taken over all the coffee tables. And then you've got that problem of Wi-Fi and people doing calls in the middle of a coffee shop. And okay, fair enough, we did a lot of face-to-face meetings, so there were meeting rooms and stuff we used, but it was really a mess. And I don't know what the answer is. I do think it's a case of letting people be adults and figure it out. But I also think it's a case of you can't let them figure it out without some sort of parameters to say, you need to do some face-to-face time in the office. If you're near an office, there's no point if you live in another city and there's no office to commute every week to go to that office. I mean, we got a guy in New York. He goes into Boston maybe every 3 weeks, 4 weeks, which is fine. It's manageable. It's planned.
Yeah. Yeah. What haven't we? Sorry. What have we not touched on in terms of the burnout conversation as it relates to tech? Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you some of the other things that came up in the conversation. So, I mean, I obviously went through my usual things about meetings being shorter and less of them, and using technology asynchronously, which really resonated with a lot of people. Using surveys to collect feedback does work, but it's more about the in-person stuff. There's also a lot of them are talking about how having this fixed in-office time 2-3 days a week was hurting their recruitment activities. People were going for jobs which were flexible. There was also some discussion around sending care packages home, sending equipment to people so they had decent equipment at home, and that actually working out better than bringing them into the office. Good headphones, good microphone, good speakerphones, microphones, whatever you want to call them, to go with a standing desk, maybe not a full standing desk, but a budget towards a standing desk. So if you had I can't remember what I paid for mine, but let's say it was £300 towards a £600 standing desk, you could buy your desk or you could buy the standing desk. It's up to you. So there was a couple of those sort of things that came up, which I thought was quite nice. And then the other piece which I mentioned was the technology piece of having a better experience in the office, but also an expectation that every meeting room that you went into had the capability to do a call. Whereas in the old world, it was almost the case that some meeting rooms would have and some meetings wouldn't have. But because you're dealing with more of a collaborative environment, the expectation is you might have people go into an office to sit around a boardroom table to talk about something and dial someone in who's not there, because people are now geolocated far away. So we did talk a lot about how people that once they realized that they could work remotely were saying, well, can I go back to my home country and work from there? But now the tax implications of that comes in, the time zone comes in, all those things. But because they're good performers, to keep them, and also to not lose the skills, because to rehire the skills in this market are tough, the company had to make the offer or make it work, or be a bit more open to making it work, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think that's a good sign.
Yeah, I agree. I think the piece around the making sure that meeting rooms are well set up to do calls can't be underestimated, because that to me is still one of the worst parts of the hybrid experience, is having some people on in an office together, some people on a screen, and if there are audio issues or one side can't hear each other, but it's because the connection is poor, all of those things just really make the discrepancy between the office and the remote set very obvious, and you can kind of cut either group off from the conversation depending on, are there more people on the remote call, are there more people on the office call? So yeah, I think that's really not going to go away. So one of the more key things to get right in terms of preparing the office for things like back to office planning, or just optimizing it so people don't feel as, it's incredibly frustrating, right, to have a just fine meeting experience at home, and then to go in and have this hybrid meeting experience that is a poor experience, and you can't even talk to your colleagues just because of technology.
Well, exactly. And I wouldn't say you can ever do. It can't be one or the other. I don't think you could say I'm only ever working from home and I'm only ever working in the office in a day. Some days you may have to go into the office because you've got a couple of face-to-face things, and you have to do that call with other people, which may be one of those experiences. And I think that those will happen. But and that's the point, is the technology has to get to a point, or at least the offering in the office has to get to a point that those things are that pain is reduced as much as possible. And I think it's possible. I don't think we need new technology. I just think we need as a business, they need to just put that investment in if they want people in the office. If they don't want people in the office, and they're going to use them as collaboration centers where you're not doing calls from them, then that's also fine. But then it's got to be clear; it can't be ambiguous.
Well, I guess on the survey component of the question, did you get to kind of what to do when you get that survey feedback back?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest thing that came out of that is you got to listen to the feedback. Now, that's not to say that you just take everything in and you use everything that comes in, but you've got to make it clear that you've heard the feedback. So, if the feedback is the coffee's really terrible in the coffee shop, and one person says that, you're probably not going to do anything about it. But if you're getting maybe 10, 20%, 30% of your working force that's saying it's a problem, then you have to do something about it. Or at least communicate that you're going to look at new vendors or whatever it is. So it's just a case of being heard and feedback loops and all the rest of it. And again, it comes back to if the coffee's bad, and that's what people like. I remember when I was with Hilo, we used to work out of a WeWork, and I loved it because we had a barista downstairs. It was part of the deal. And you walk in, and there'd be a long line, and you'd walk past, you'd wave, you'd order your coffee, you'd come back an hour later, and it'd be ready for you, and it was good coffee. And when we moved to another building where we didn't have the coffee shop, it used to piss me off. It was such a silly thing, but I used to enjoy that because I used to walk back up to the WeWork. I used to walk in, pay for a cup of coffee because it was just a good cup of coffee. And I had this routine where I'd go get the coffee at WeWork and I'd go sit. There's like these benches against the wall, against the windows. So you can sit there, have a cup of coffee. I'd have my iPad open or whatever I was using, and I'd catch up on the emails that I had that morning, and I'd just drink my coffee before I get to the office and get bombarded by whatever's going on, and it would just ease me into the day. And when I realized when we moved to the other office, I didn't have that. You'd have to go upstairs through your office to the coffee machine, and by the time you did that, you'd been thumped by 10 things. So you didn't really feel like you'd eased in the day. It was like straight into it, and it would always put you on the back foot. So I can see how that little things like that make a big difference. But I think it's, as I say, just listening, putting in place a plan to either address it or not address it, but communicate it. We're not going to address it because the coffee vendor is, we all think, 70% of the organization says it's fine. And, people either get used to it or they don't. As a silly example.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to look at it, to make sure that you communicate the feedback was heard, whether or not it gets actioned on based on business priorities. And
well, I say, we all have to be realistic that not every bit of feedback will be taken and actioned, and that's just a maturity thing. But you also shouldn't not give feedback, because you think, oh, no one's going to do anything about it. I think that's important there, because many voices will bring change, but one voice won't, So if only one person says there's a problem, it'll fall away. But if many people start saying there's a problem, then it'll get attention at some point. It might be years after you've left, but that doesn't matter.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. I need to run, but it was good catching up with you. Talk to you later.
Bye.
See you there. Bye.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Heather Bicknell is our producer and editor. Thank you, Heather, for your hard work on this episode. Please subscribe to the series and rate us on iTunes or the Google Play Store. Follow us on Twitter @the DWW Podcast. The show notes and transcripts will be available on the website www.digitalworkspace.works. Please also visit our website www.digitalworkspace.works and subscribe to our newsletter. And lastly, if you found this episode useful, please share with your friends or colleagues.